Welcome to the November schedule of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. This is our 31st year, and we appreciate the loyal support. When we started this 31 years ago, we didn't know if we didn't know where we were going. Have we ever heard about that before? At that time, we had lots of wonderful participants in World War II, but Harold chose that November was going to be his date to either give a lecture on one of his topics or teach a phase of his World War II history course. And if I could, how many in the audience were students of Harold Deutsch? Stand up. Stand up, students of Harold Deutsch. Isn't that great? I think we're part of a great brotherhood. Thank you. So when Harold passed, the November program has been dedicated as the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. And we always try to have a connection to Harold, as will be revealed later this evening. I also want to recognize Elizabeth Deutsch, Harold's widow. If you'd stand up, Elizabeth, and her granddaughter, Teresa. Thank you for coming. How many World War II veterans do we have in the audience? Would they stand up? Hey, there's a couple over here, aren't there? Thank you guys for coming out, especially on this cold nights. I mean, you guys have got to be in your 60s now, right? Well, we love you guys. That's what we're all about. This is again, it's the Harold Deutsch Lecture. And one of the things we always try to do is to find a historian, a speaker that has a connection to Harold. And again, I'll let Connie reveal that. But Connie studied with Harold, is writing a book on Harold, and will introduce our speaker this evening.
Tonight, I would like to take a few moments to talk about an aspect of Harold's career that not a lot of people know about. Well, some people know about, but he was his radio career from 1939 to 1942. Besides his duties as a professor at the University of Minnesota, Harold Deutsch was a radio commentator at WCCO. And I choose that because the years that Bill is going to be covering tonight are 1937 to 1941. After Cedric Adams, who in his day was the Walter Cronkite, or for you really young folks, the Anderson Cooper of his day, he delivered the news. Dr. Deutsch would provide an analysis of what was said, much like you hear these political pundits, although I got to say Harold Deutsch's commentary was very insightful. He would also answer a question from a listener during these. So he'd do his analysis and then he'd answer a question. His final radio broadcast was on New Year's Eve, 1942-1943. Then he went to work full-time for the Board of Economic Warfare for a short time before he joined the OSS. Now, in his papers at the Military History Institute, part of the Army War College, where Bill is a part of, I found all his scripts from these radio broadcasts. And I must say, it was a lot of fun reading over all these scripts, and I always had to keep in mind that he didn't know the outcome of World War II, but a lot of his analysis was incredibly enlightening. Often in his radio broadcasts, he would mention his travels in Europe in the 1930s. He went in 1936 and 1938. For instance, he mentioned his 1938 meeting with Colonel Nikolai, who was during World War I, was the head of Germany's Secret Service and propaganda. And they discussed the Nazi attitudes towards democracy and what Hitler might do with and he connected that to what Hitler might do with the German and French peace treaties. He figured correctly that the Nazis would keep the French democracy somewhat intact and tightly controlled. He did find one aspect, Deutsch did find one aspect of the French government's peace with the Germans very dishonorable, which was that they handed over German nationals over to the German Nazis. So Germans that had fled Germany to get away from Hitler were then handed back over to the Nazis. Now, one of the things I mentioned in this month's round tablet was the change in U.S.-British relations with the appointment of Winston Churchill as the British Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940. But that was kind of one of the things I was looking at when I was going through these, is what was Harold Deutsch's opinion of this change. And I was lucky enough to find it on a radio broadcast script from May 19th, 1940. He answered a question from the listener. The listener asked, "Can the new British government be expected to do much better than the one under Chamberlain? Isn't it just a reshuffle of the same old gang?" And Harold's answer, while quite lengthy, is very enlightening. And he said, "My answer to that is perhaps more emphatic than most observers. For one thing, I have always been a particular admirer of Winston Churchill. To me, he is one of the few figures of genius in the history of English politics. The almost incredible stories one hears about his energy and powers of work are perfectly true. He probably knows more about military matters than any civilian ever has. I know he has often been accused of being both boisterous and too ambitious for a position of great responsibility. But I, for one, am convinced that he is now absolutely devoted to his job. What worried me most when it was announced Churchill would take over was that he would be hampered by politics and would have to fill many important posts with old party wheel horses. There's nothing worse than having bold plans of a man like Churchill carried out by timid souls who are full of mental reservations. That was the trouble with his great idea of forcing the Dardanelles in 1915. Of course, most historians would start to debate Harold Deutsch on whether the Dardanelles was a good idea in 1915 or not. But Harold continued with his praise. "Well, things look much better now. If you examine the cabinet list, you will find plenty of big political names. But these aren't the people who hold the really important jobs. Such men as Chamberlain, Sir John Simon, and labor leaders Attlee and Greenwood have only high-sounding titles. In effect, they've been kicked upstairs. And some of the new men are first-rate, like the Minister of Supply, Herbert Morrison. That's really what the work of the British cabinet amounts to at the moment, supplying the army. But just as being there means a lot too, for the first time since the Treaty of Versailles, England has a government that enjoys the confidence of the entire country. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of that." And that is how he ended his radio broadcast that night. So, as you know, our speaker this evening will be discussing the evolution of the U.S.-British alliance from 1937 to 1941. Professor William Johnsen received his B.S. from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he served in the Army for 20 years. He holds a master's and a Ph.D. from Duke University, and at present, he is the professor of military, and it's a very long title, the professor of military history and strategy in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Since May 2016, he has served as the Henry L. Stimson Chair of Military Studies at the same institution. In other words, here's Bill. So,
this is an appropriate time, I think, for such a presentation. As all of you know, I'm sure, yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the torch landings, the invasion of North Africa in 1942. Tomorrow is the 72nd anniversary of the arrival of the USS St. Paul in Shanghai, China, at the end of World War II. Saturday marks Veterans Day and the 99th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. And so all of that comes together, and what does it have to do with here? It lends to some of the background. And it also talks, I think, to the daunting challenges that at least I face in trying to bring to life some of this for you. Both Don has mentioned and Connie, I have a somewhat tenuous relationship with Dr. Deutsch. Many years ago, when this picture was taken, he was inducted as a Distinguished Fellow of the United States Army War College. And I had the great fortune of being asked as whether or not I would be his escort officer. And I said, what historian wouldn't want to escort Harold Deutsch and talk with him? And so that morning, I picked him up. We met just outside Bliss Hall, our lecture hall. And we were making small talk before somebody else pulled him away, and I didn't get any more time to talk to him. But I asked him, I said, Dr. Deutsch, I understand that you have the reputation for being a pretty prodigious poker player. And he said, yeah, we quit at 2:30 this morning. I was taking all their money. They made me stop. And this is at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I think that sort of epitomized the energy, enthusiasm, and I am quite envious of all of you who stood up earlier and talked about how you had been able to be Dr. Deutsch's students. I think that is something I would have enjoyed tremendously. So what we're going to talk about today, give you a brief look at that. And so why this book? Part of it is because I have always been curious as how it was that the United States Army in 1939 could go from about 190,000 people, including the entire Army Air Corps, the 18th or 19th largest army in the world, somewhere behind Portugal and Bulgaria. And in 1945, was part of a coalition that defeated two of the greatest military establishments that history has seen. And so as I began to study this at a very young age, I had the great fortune to have a visiting professor at West Point named Jay Luvos. Some of you may know him from Civil War fame. And Jay introduced me to this concept of coalition warfare and coalition operations. And either as a student of history or a practitioner in the military, I've followed that question of coalition warfare, this connection of national policy and grand strategy ever since. And so that's the reason why. And if you happen to have read or look at the book, these are the primary themes that I look at in terms of how do you ensure some form of effective coalition cooperation. And as you see, there are a number of secondary issues that you can't get away from if you're going to talk about this period. What is the role of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill? What is the special relationship? Did such that relationship exist? Clearly, there are questions of what was Franklin Roosevelt's intent on how the United States entered the war. And we can talk about that during the Q&A. And somewhat, this was suggested to me when I was a graduate student, that I was rehabilitating Winston Churchill somewhat as a grand strategist. I thought that was very interesting because I always had considered him one of those. So I was a little surprised at the thought that someone would think that I would actually be doing that. So that's primarily where we'll go this evening. These are sort of the milestones along the way, just to give you some ideas. And our first, I am a historian, so like many of you who enjoy this, it's how did we get to this place? And so I am a firm proponent of the idea that you can't know where you're going if you haven't understood how you got here. And so I began looking back at the lessons of World War I. And what did the Americans and the British take out of World War I experience? Because many of the younger, even colonel-level officers in 1917-18 would go on to hold positions of high responsibility at the time of this period. And so one of the issues that came about, and this is a picture of the military representatives to the Supreme War Council of the Allies. I won't bore you with the long, complicated decisions, crises that led to the establishment of this organization, but in November of 1917, the Allies finally decided that they needed to do some coordination at the governmental level, and that they needed military advisors in order to be able to do that. And they set up this council. And it worked effectively, eventually. And it became part of the model for how cooperation would occur early in World War II. They were also part of something called the Unified Command. And eventually it took the disasters of March through June 1918 to convince the Allies that they actually had to appoint a single general officer, in this case Ferdinand Foch, in order to lead the Allies in order to avoid defeat. And so those were the two of the success stories. Some of the less success stories concern something called amalgamation. And amalgamation is what we would call today combined operations or interdependent operations. It's where you get the elements of more than one country's military operating at the same time. And so there's two sides to this story. The first of that is on the left, William S. Sims. He was an American admiral. He was the president of the Naval War College just before the United States entered the war in April 1917. He was a known Anglophile, and in fact, he had been reprimanded by President William Howard Taft because he had published an article that said that the Germans were going to attack, and when they did, we need to ally with the British against the Germans. So it was a belief that he was well connected in London, and they sent him off to do the initial coordination. At the same time, there was still a fairly intense rivalry between the United States Navy and the Royal Navy. And when Sims was given his marching orders by the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral William Benson, Benson admonished Sims, and I quote, "Do not let the British pull the wool over your eyes. We would as soon fight the British as the Germans," end quote. Sims gets to London just almost immediately after the United States declares war. He very quickly looks at the situation and surmises that the threat to Britain is not the German high seas fleet, it's the U-boats. And he calls upon the United States to strip out all of the destroyers and small ships away from the United States fleet and send them to Britain immediately. This does not sit well with the naval leadership of the United States Navy because they want to lead their battleships in battle against the German high seas fleet. Sims prevails, and they strip out the destroyers and send them to Britain. At the same time, he convinces the President and the Navy to defer the building of capital ships, battleships, which is started in 1916, and change all of the shipbuilding into smaller craft, destroyers and subchasers. As you would expect, this did not go well with the naval hierarchy. Even though Sims was proven right, it still created great animosity between the Royal Navy and the United States Navy. So much to the point that when President Woodrow Wilson came to Versailles for the peace treaty and he noticed Sims, he remarked to one of his aides, he should be wearing a British uniform, not an American one. All of this colored the relationships between the United States Navy and the Royal Navy throughout the interwar era. And as a result, it also colored the relationships between the two governments. The other who will be familiar to most of you is John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force. And the question of how you would integrate or amalgamate American troops into British or French formations. Even before Pershing departed from the United States, there were British and French delegations lobbying President Wilson. Wilson was adamant that there would be an independent AEF, and he gave Pershing those marching orders. As soon as Pershing lands in France in 1917, he's under increasing pressure, and by June of 1918, the British and French are reeling. The Germans are marching on Paris, and Pershing is at a conference with the Supreme War Council, and I'm going to read just a bit to tell you how heated this got. Foch, commander of the French forces, to Pershing, "You are willing to risk our being driven back to the Loire? Purging, yes, I'm willing to take that risk. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, well, we will refer it to your president. Purging's response to Lloyd George, refer it to the president and be damned. I know what the president will do. He will simply refer it back to me for recommendation, and I will make the same recommendation as I have made today. Now, eventually, the force of circumstances would cause Pershing to release some elements of the American Expeditionary Force. They did serve with British and French units. However, what created some animosity was, while the French would allow their units to serve under American commanders, with the exception of some very small British units, chemical companies and small supply units, the British would not allow their soldiers to serve under Americans. That created a tremendous amount of animosity that would come back to haunt the British and American relationship in the period under investigation here. And so a polite way of putting this was General Fox Connor, who was the G3, Pershing's G3 operations officer in the American Expeditionary Force. He would give an annual speech at the Army War College, pretty much along these lines, and he would lay it out. Less politely, I would say that U.S. political and military leaders came away with very deeply held views about dealing with the British. Some of those were positive. Most, however, whether it was the Army or the Navy, held intense suspicion, resentment, and sometimes outright dislike. And that would clearly shade things in the future. Moving into the interwar era, it's the U.S. and British reactions to what's going on post-World War I. The British public, for a large extent, were very upset at the Americans. You sat out the war, you let us bleed and spend our money while you made money, and then you come in at the very end and claim victory. And so there was a lot of resentment on the British side. On the U.S. side, many people forget or don't know that in 1915, 1916, the British were interfering with American ships on the high seas, and we very nearly came to blow with Britain. And so there was a lot of resentment for that. The British were, in American views at least, welching on their war debts. The Americans were very unhappy with colonialism in India, in the British Empire, with how the Brits were treating Ireland. And there was a very large anti-British thread to much of American policy in the 20s and 30s, to the point that there were even some states who passed laws that said you could only teach American. You could not teach English in public schools. This was also due to some economic competition. New York had supplanted London as the head financial global organization. The United States was now the world's leading lender. Britain was a debtor, mostly to the United States. U.S. companies were taking over British enterprises, and it was a great deal of resentment all the way around. Not least was this recurring naval rivalry. The two pictures you see here, the one at the top is of the Washington Naval Conference in 1922. The one down here in the bottom is the London Naval Conference of 1930. In 1922, the U.S. Navy finally got parity with the Royal Navy in terms of battleships. They did not get parity in terms of all ships. The British still outnumbered the Americans in terms of cruisers. That was finally rectified in 1930, where the British finally agreed that not only would we have parity in battleships, but also in cruisers and other smaller light craft. The problem was, we're in the midst of the Depression at that point in time, and the United States Navy is not building ships. And so even though there's a certain amount of legal parity, in fact, there was not, and there's resentment on the side of the Americans. And at the same time, you have this question of the British Navy continuing to look down their nose at what they believe to be their naive American cousins. There's also just the pure reaction against the war. Cartoon up above is death leading the merchants of death. There were significant backlash in Britain, and there were congressional hearings held here in the United States about war profiteers and how that would work. Picture down on the bottom here is a picture of the Oxford Union, which in 1936, the Oxford Debating Society resolved that they would not serve for king and country in any future war. Very marked pacifism in Britain at this time. Things begin to crank up, 1935, 1936, 1937, and you begin to see a lot of editorial cartoons in the United States. Some people used to call them isolationists. Now it's probably more along the idea of anti-interventionists, combination of people who were for keeping America out of war, pure pacifists, and people who just plain didn't like the British. Last but not least, personalities come in. Franklin Roosevelt at the top and Neville Chamberlain below. Franklin Roosevelt is very anti-imperialist, very anti-British colonialism, and makes no bones about that. Neville Chamberlain becomes the prime minister in 1937, and for Chamberlain it becomes personal. He not only does not trust the United States as a strategic partner, he does not trust Franklin Roosevelt. And to a certain degree, Chamberlain has good cause. Roosevelt, when he became president, undercut Chamberlain's position as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, ruined a World Economic Conference that might possibly have brought much of the United States out of depression. So at the bottom line is, by mid-1937, the relationships between the United States and Great Britain are very perilous. And after nearly 2 decades of economic competition, diplomatic dysfunction, and contrary personalities, it appeared to many on both sides of the Atlantic that there was no basis for cooperation between the United States and Britain. However, as Lord Palmerston, the British foreign minister, once noted, supposedly in 1848, we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. Palmerston's comment just as easily could have applied to the United States because the geostrategic conditions were changing. And for this audience, I'm sure there's no need to elaborate on the rise of either Italian fascism, German Nazism, or militarist Japan. But by 1937, the Japanese occupation of central China begins to draw the United States and Britain closer together. And this will set the stage. This is a picture of the USS Panay, which was an American gunboat on the Yangtze River that the Japanese sunk on the 12th of December 1937, along with 3 Standard Oil tankers. The ships clearly had American flags painted where they could be seen. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that the Japanese had to know that these were American ships. And so, as a result of this, Franklin Roosevelt decides that he's going to send the Chief of War Plans, the gentleman here on the right, at that time Captain Royal Ingersoll, to Britain to engage in conversations with the Brits. And this is then Captain Sir Tom Phillips, the equivalent Chief of War Plans. Ingersoll arrives on New Year's Day and is immediately met by the First Sea Lord and a high member of the British Foreign Office. Now, before Ingersoll goes off, he has a chance to meet with Franklin Roosevelt and get direct guidance. That guidance must have been very vague because Sir Alexander Cadogan, the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Ministry, said, "He seems nice and his instructions are helpful, but he seems not clear of his objective." And so we can commiserate with Ingersoll because Henry Stimson, at one point in time, that said trying to get guidance out of Franklin Roosevelt was like a sunbeam chasing a dust mote around the room. And Roosevelt was always adept, even like telling people, "I never tell my right hand what my left hand is doing." Nonetheless, Ingersoll spends a couple of weeks talking with his British counterparts and comes away with an agreement on how, if the United States and Britain are going to cooperate, they will engage in what they then called a distant blockade of Japan. They exchange code books, which is quite secret at the time. They exchanged order of battle, what ships were ready and what were not. They would look at liaisons, codes, and the exchange of liaison officers. That worked through the summer of 1938, when the British naturally become much more absorbed by what's going on in Europe. That's Captain Russell Wilson at the time. He was the naval attaché in London that makes arrangements for a British officer who is en route to the Far East to meet with Admiral William Leahy, at that time the Chief of Naval Operations. This is so secret that they actually meet in Leahy's private quarters in civilian clothes. And one of the issues that erupts is the British officer, Commander Hampton, who's later killed off Crete in 1941, tells Leahy that the Brits no longer have enough ships to counter the North Atlantic while fielding a fleet in the Far East against Japan. Leahy says that's not really a problem. The United States Navy will take care of that. Now, he has no authority to do that. He is, however, a close friend and confidant of Franklin Roosevelt. However, this idea that we were going to divide the world up with the Brits in the Atlantic and the Americans in the Pacific will create a problem that will dog these negotiations for the rest of their time. Last but not least, I'll just briefly look. This is the guy, same gentleman. Up in the right is, at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond E. Lee. He was the U.S. attaché in London from 1935 to 1939, and then came back in 1940 after the fall of France until Pearl Harbor. Lee was very close confidant of the senior British Army leadership. He was able to convey information back and forth between our governments. He loved to wear a straw boater because it was very American and he knew it made the Brits mad. So while the militaries begin to cease talking during the so-called phony war, 1939 to 1940, before the invasion of France, there's a lot going on in terms of supply negotiations. Most of you are probably familiar with the aircraft in these pictures, P-38, 39, and 40, B-17, and the F-4, and a Grant and Lee tank. Probably a little less familiar with all of these gentlemen. This is Henry Woodring, the Secretary of War, Lewis Johnsen, one of his undersecretaries, and Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Corps. This is Jean Monnet, who will eventually become the leader of the European community. But he is in Washington in 1938, 1939, negotiating armaments for the French. Arthur Purvis of the British Purchasing Commission, a civilian who will play a great role until his untimely death in an aircraft accident in 1941. This is Sir John Slessor, the British Chief of Air War Plans, who was sent to the United States in 1940 to help work on supply issues, and a British Major General Pickingham Walsh, who was the guy negotiating for tanks. Why is this important? In a nutshell, the French place millions of dollars worth of orders. By June of 1940, they have placed orders for $612 million. That's $10.5 billion in current dollars for aircraft and tanks. The British do not. But what the British oftentimes forget to tell anybody is on 16 June 1940, the French signed all of their contracts over to the Brits. And the Brits got all of that equipment. And why is that important? Well, part of it is important because it primed our economic pump. It helped bring us out of the Depression. It's important because that money helps us build the infrastructure in places like Wichita and Seattle and Long Beach, probably even here in Minnesota, that allows aircraft to be built, plant space, tool and die, jigs, all of those things. These aircraft will become some of the critical aircraft of World War II. We find out that the P-39's not a very good airplane because we sell it to the Brits and it doesn't do well. We do, however, give thousands of them to the Russians, who use them for ground attack aircraft. And one of the stories I really like to tell of the F-4, there was no money in the US budget to build the F-4. The French took it over and kept the assembly line hot because they were willing to take any airplane that they needed. So if it hadn't been for the French orders, the F-4 would not have been produced, and we would have had far, far inferior aircraft at Coral Sea and Midway. Not least, it's the cooperation among all of these gentlemen that begins to build the bonds and the ties between the various militaries as they're working along. All of this works fairly well until the fall of France, when everyone's strategic calculus has to change. The Americans were quite stunned that the French would fall as quickly as they did. This was the country that held out for 4 years. And as Connie pointed out, when Churchill comes to power, nobody's quite sure. Remember, this is the Winston Churchill of 1940. This is not the Churchill of 1945. And the Churchill in 1940 is a very tenuous hold on the prime ministership. If you ever have an opportunity, there's a wonderful book written by a woman named Lynn Olson called Troublesome Young Gentlemen, which depicts how closely it was run for Churchill to actually become the prime minister and stay. And so what's going to happen? We've given all this material. The Brits have been thrown off the continent. They literally have virtually no heavy equipment. And Franklin Roosevelt makes the decision that he's going to send 500,000 rifles, 80,000 machine guns, 25,000 automatic rifles, 316 mortars, 875 75mm cannons, and over 1 million rounds of ammunition for those cannons, at a time when the American Army has none of that. And in fact, Walter Beadle Smith, who will rise to 4 stars during the war, notes, if we were required to mobilize after having released guns necessary for this mobilization and were found short in artillery material, everyone who is party to the deal might hope to be found hanging from a lamppost. And so the question becomes, do we continue to support the British? Our cupboard is bare. We are not yet the arsenal of democracy. That has not yet happened. There's a number of other activities going on. I don't know whether this is going to help or hurt my talk tonight, but Charles Lindbergh in the America First, strong anti-interventionist, not wanting to get the United States involved in war. This is a very big issue in 1940. Also remarkably, at the time, there was considerable worry and anxiety that the Germans and the Italians were going to seize South America, and that the United States should be more concerned about Latin America, close to home in the Western Hemisphere, than it should be about what was going on in Europe. And so Roosevelt has some hard decisions to make, and his military, George Marshall, Harold Stark, Chief of Staff of the Army and Chief of Naval Operations, are advising him, stay home. We need to mobilize. We need all of our equipment. We need to defend our hemisphere and defend our territories, Alaska, the Philippines, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal. Don't send anything more. Roosevelt wants to aid the British, and as a result, he sends these 3 gentlemen to Britain in August of 1940. Gentleman at the top is Rear Admiral Robert Gormley. This is Major General Delos C. Emmons. He is the Deputy Chief of the Air Corps, and this is General George V. Strong, the current Chief of War Plans in the War Department. Gormley is the Chief War Planner for the Navy. And so when this delegation arrives, the British think that the Americans are going to enter the war. You would not have sent these high-ranking men, particularly Strong as the Army War Planner, if you were not going to immediately engage in some form of supporting the British actively in the war. As a result, they were exposed to a large number of very senior officers and political leaders from Churchill on down. And they were quite taken aback when Gormley, who is the senior man, said, actually, we're not here to do that. We are not a joint body. We have no authority to make any commitments. We are only here to listen to whatever you have to tell us. And so the British hopes were dashed. But for about 10 days, they take all of these gentlemen around England, and the 3 of them become convinced that Britain will survive. And so when Strong and Emmons return back to the United States, they provide a report to Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and to Franklin Roosevelt. Both conclude that Britain will survive, and most importantly, they noted in the report, we both have the very definite feeling that sooner or later the United States will be drawn into this war. And from this point forward, I think that's true. You can watch some halting steps, but clearly steps that help lead the United States into more active contribution. So Gormley, this is Gormley later in the war, shortly after he's been relieved of command in the South Pacific, for being emotionally exhausted, which looks that way. This is Alan Kirk, the current naval attaché in London, and Harold Stark, who is the Chief of Naval Operations. Gormley is in London by himself. His guidance from Stark is, find out as much as you can. Commit Nothing. And the British welcome him in. They show him their secrets. There's been an entire Royal Navy committee that's been working on how do you gain cooperation from the United States. And Gormley stays in London for 4 months. And he does a great deal of work. He learns how the British are doing convoy systems. He learns about their new ASDIC and sonar, their microwave and radar. All of this information gets passed back to the United States and really goes a long way towards saving not only time for American planning, but American lives once the U.S. Navy gets into the war. At the same time, the Brits are trying to get us involved in the Pacific, in the Far East. The gentleman up here is Air Marshal Robert Brooke Popham. He's the commander of all British forces in the Far East, based out of Singapore. This is Admiral Tommy Hart, who commands the Asiatic Fleet in Manila. And this is his Chief of Staff, William Purnell. Purnell is a ubiquitous character in this story. He's everywhere all the time. He's in Singapore, he's in Batavia, he's back in Manila, he's back in Singapore, but he has no instructions and he has no ability to do anything. So he's listening a lot. He's not very happy because he gets invited to a conference that is supposed to be coordination between the British, the Dutch, and the Americans. Apparently they forgot to invite the Dutch. And it's all about pressuring the Americans to join in and defend Singapore. Purnell tries to convince the British that this isn't going to happen. This is not what's going to go on. And the British just kind of talk slower and talk louder to him and don't pay any attention to what he has to say. And again, this is sort of the contrast about how cooperation occurs. And I hate to say this, but my clock died. Can you make sure I stay on time, please? There's lots of cooperation in the Atlantic. There's lots of agreement on what the two navies are going to do. There is almost none in the Pacific. And this will be a problem that plagues the organization for the rest of the time, up until the point where the Japanese solve the problem for us. All of this leads eventually to the first American talks, British talks, actually held in Washington, D.C. in January, March. One of my arguments is that the coalition grand strategy is solidified at these meetings 9 months before Pearl Harbor. That there is an agreed grand strategy and a way ahead for a coalition should, as Franklin Roosevelt called it, the United States be compelled to go to war. So interesting cast of characters here. This is then Major General Stanley Embick, anti-British. He was on the Supreme War Council as an American representative in World War I. He does not like the British at all. His son-in-law is a man by the name of Albert C. Wedemeyer, who Embick got sent to the German General Staff College from 1936 to 1938, brings Wedemeyer back onto the Army staff as a planner. So now you have two planners, father-in-law and son-in-law, who don't like the British, who are engaged in talks with the British. Gormley comes back from London. This is Leonard Giroux, Chief of Army War Plans, Sherman Miles, the G2. This is an interesting character named Richmond Kelly Turner, whose nickname is Terrible. So he's Terrible Turner, and it's a well-earned name. Hard drinking, hard swearing, hard cussing, hard working, workaholic. He hates the British. Just hates them. This is Joseph McNarney, probably the least known but most important four-star in World War II. He goes on, he's the chief air planner. He becomes Marshall's deputy chief of staff. He's Marshall's hatchet man when he needs one, and he becomes a deputy theater commander in the Mediterranean. Hardly anybody knows anything about him. If you talk to people... What's his name? Joseph T. McNarney. On the British side, Admiral Roger Bellairs, very senior naval officer. Admiral in 1932, he'd worked disarmament conferences, he knew the Americans. He was always brought back to do secret negotiations with people. This is Victor Danckwerts, the chief naval planner. This is General Morris, who's just come out of the War Office, and Slessor. Slessor is one of the brightest people to come out of the British Armed Forces. He will eventually become Marshal of the Royal Air Force. One of my favorite comments from Schlesser is they're in the midst of all these negotiations, and they've reached an impasse, and the British go to Lord Halifax, their ambassador, and try and involve Halifax and Roosevelt in political. The Americans just go ballistic. And Schlesser's comment in his autobiography is, the Americans think us pernicious. What they fail to understand is sometimes we can just be stupid. I actually tried to get into his papers. I was told that I could. When I showed up at the Royal Air Force Museum, Hendon, they said, well, sorry. They went from being the 25-year rule to the 75-year rule because he said such bad things about people. So someday, maybe somebody in this room will have an opportunity to go find out what that is. But the long and the short of it is they engage in very intense negotiations. Again, success in the Atlantic, less success in the Pacific. And in fact, the talks almost founder immediately because they try and tackle the tough nut first and almost literally come to blows across the conference tables. And so they decide to work on the Atlantic. They do so. They come up with some very strong agreements, and they cannot arrive at any understanding for the Far East. So instead of having a knockdown, drag-out battle over it, they decide, well, we'll turn it over to the local commanders in the Far East. They'll figure out a way to get through that. We'll find out that that's not going to happen. But this is really what comes out of the talks. And one of my points is the United States drove these outcomes. One of the myths, I think, of World War II is that the United States was the junior partner, the naive American cousin. I personally don't believe that to be the case. Now, certainly, is there convergence of British and American interests? Absolutely. But every time there comes down to a hard decision on strategy or allocation of war material up to Pearl Harbor, the United States prevails in that discussion. We divide the world up into areas of responsibility, create a liaison machinery, and we completely fall apart in the Far East. So now, how do you put all that agreement into practice? One of the things that we teach our students at the War College is strategy without implementation is just words. Somebody actually has to make something happen. And that's what they try and do from April 41 until the end of the war. I'm sorry, until Pearl Harbor, excuse me. Now, they have some problems because they send this agreement to Franklin Roosevelt, who sits on it for 2 months, and then sends it back with a note from his military aide that says, the president has seen this. Because the British government has not yet approved it, he will not approve it. Send it back to him if there's war. And so if you're Marshall and Stark, how do you plan for all of this? Well, they make the decision and say, well, the president didn't say no, so it must be okay. And this is how they direct their planners to proceed. So almost immediately, in May of 1941, this is the British Joint Staff Mission. The three gentlemen up there, Admiral Little, General Weems, and Bomber, who will eventually be known as Bomber Harris. So the Brits send three very high-level representatives. You can see, this wouldn't be an Army briefing if you didn't have an organization chart and a wiring diagram, so I have to throw that in. But they set up the machinery for cooperation with the U.S. counterparts in Washington, D.C. Now, at this point in time, there is no such thing as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That does not come into being officially until 1947. So you have the Army and the Navy. Well, the British system, they all talk to each other. In the American system, nobody talks to anybody. And this creates some problems as the British try and work with their American counterparts, particularly the Navy, who are trying to work with Terrible Turner, who just continues to nitpick him and nitpick him and nitpick him over just because I think he was ornery. On the American side, we set up a similar organization in London in May of 1941. So by May of 1941, this is a picture that you see here. This is the entire American Special Army Observer Group. Most of the people you see in the picture there are British civilians or American civilians who are working for them. Only the officers are here in the front row. The rest of these are all support people. That becomes important because when you look at all the things that they have to do, it's the proverbial, you have too many things to do with too little time with too few people. And this will be something that continues to plague the alliance. But they work very strongly together. They have great relations with their British counterparts. Contrary to what's going on in Washington, they are actually brought into the meetings of the British chiefs of staff. They were brought into British planning meetings, and they are truly doing what we would call coalition planning in London. In fact, they become so close that there's a fear in Washington that they've gone native and that they're not actually representing the best interests of the United States. And that will come back to haunt several of those individuals later in life. At the same time, we're going back to the Pacific. This just gives you a brief idea of the Japanese expansion throughout this time period, 1937 to mid-1941. The Japanese are on the march. And what are we doing? Well, we've got Brooke Popham again and Purnell, and they're back in Singapore. And Brooke Popham and his planners are continuing to tell the United States that you need to come to Singapore. You need to bring the fleet. Purnell keeps saying, we're not going to send the fleet. They said, well, no, that's not a problem. You bring the fleet here. You know, we've got this great anchorage. And in fact, well, we don't have dry docks, and we don't have enough pier and berthing space. So if you come, can you bring construction engineers and build us dry docks? And so not only do they want us to protect Singapore, they want us to help build Singapore. And oh, by the way, at a conference that takes place in April, the decision is made that the Dutch and the Americans will defend the Philippines, Singapore, and the supposed Malay barrier. The British fleet will guard convoys in the Indian Ocean. So Purnell, I think somewhat rightly says, you expect us to fight the Japanese while you convoy. And Brooke Popham says, yes, we think that's a smashing idea. And the Americans naturally don't quite see it that way. The British override Purnell's objections, and they write up a report that has political commitments, military commitments, all the things that Purnell told them that they could not do. Now, an interesting thing happens with that report. The Brits, Brooke Popham, immediately telegraphs the complete report to his counterparts, not only in London, but also in Washington. The Americans, for some reasons that I can't figure out, take a hard copy of the report, they put it on a Pan Am Clipper aircraft, and they fly it to San Francisco. When it gets to San Francisco, for some reason, the naval personnel, instead of flying it onward, put it on the proverbial slow boat from San Francisco through the Panama Canal to Norfolk. It takes 2 months for the report to get to Washington, D.C., and the Americans are forced to rely on a very cryptic British copy that doesn't have all of the problems in it. And so when it finally arrives, the Americans are incredibly upset, particularly the Navy, and they begin to take it out on the British Joint Staff Mission in Washington, as well as on the Special Observer Group. Okay, that must be me. It tells me I'm done. So, the rest of the story. This is Harry Hopkins. If you don't know who Harry Hopkins is, he's Franklin Roosevelt's fixer. And there's lots of problems between the Americans and the British. And in July of 1941, Roosevelt sends Hopkins to talk to Churchill about all sorts of problems with strategy and the implementation of the ABC-1. Hopkins has stomach cancer, he's ill, he's sick, he's got heart problems. Roosevelt decides, well, a trip to Britain's not enough, I'm going to send you to Moscow. And so he comes back from Moscow, he's very ill, and about this time we have the Atlantic Conference. The iconic photograph at the top, Roosevelt and Churchill and all of their military men, Argentia Bay on the deck of the Prince of Wales, who has just come back from fighting the Bismarck in May of 1941. I'm going to set aside all of the questions about the politics of the Atlantic Conference. If you want to talk about that in terms of the Q&A, I'll be happy to do that. But this is more about military people. And so this is an interesting group. This is Wilfred Freeman. He is the Vice Chief of the Air Staff of Britain. Hap Arnold, Harold Stark, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, Ernest King. I'll come back to King in a minute. George Marshall, Sir John Dill, and Terrible Turner. Ernie King is one of Franklin Roosevelt's favorites. In fact, Roosevelt brings him out of retirement. He's on the verge of retirement, makes him the commander of the U.S. fleet in the Atlantic. Roosevelt always used to tell people that King shaved with a blowtorch. And he was known for having one of the most mercurial and violent tempers in the Navy. He also doesn't like the British. And so this makes for a very interesting conference. His temper is so bad that one of his daughters once remarked that she said, "I don't understand why people say my father is so mercurial. He's the most even-tempered man in the Navy. He's always in a rage." And so, as a result, the American military shows up at this conference. George Marshall has 3 days' notice about the conference. He's told he cannot tell the Secretary of War where he's going. He gets no guidance from Franklin Roosevelt. He's told he can bring Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold gets 1 day's notice, and his total guidance is bring warm clothes for 10 days. And so there's a series of meetings over 4 days, quite literally. I'll leave that to the book if you want to read it. Haphazard meetings, they literally would bump into each other in passageways and have conversations. It's very difficult to sort it all out. But for me, the most important thing is this relationship. If there's a special relationship among these two, this one is very much important. George Marshall and Sir John Dill. Dill is the current Chief of Imperial General Staff. He's on his way out. Churchill does not like him. Churchill refers to him as dilly-dally because Connie talked about this gentleman who has all of these bold ideas and has timid people to implement them. Well, Dill's not timid, but he is a realist. And he does know that there is only so much that the British can do. And he's on his way out, but these two gentlemen strike up a friendship that lasts until Dill's untimely death in 1944. Dill does as much to put oil on the waters of the Anglo-American coalition as anybody that you can imagine. When Dill dies, Marshall gets special approval through Congress to bury him in Arlington National Cemetery. And so at this stage in his life, George Marshall does not make friends easily, nor does John Dill. And these are two very quite remarkable men. And we still got all the problems going on in the Far East. Not much change there. So the last few months, they're mostly concerned with national problems. They're working full speed. These are the special observers in the UK. Just to give you an idea of the quality of people that the Americans sent, Cheney goes on to be a 3-star, he becomes a 4-star, and he becomes a 4-star. And so these are very capable men. Terrible Turner is back in Washington causing problems with the British. And again, because we can't arrive at anything in the Far East, they decide once more that we're going to kick the can down the road to the major commanders in Manila. So you will all recognize Douglas MacArthur, who was recalled to active duty in July of 1941, Tommy Hart, and now Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, who is the commander of the British Eastern Fleet, which at the moment consists of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. It was supposed to have an aircraft carrier, but it grounded on the way. They meet in Manila on the 6th of December, Manila time. They meet for 1 day. They don't resolve anything. Phillips gets recalled back to Singapore because there's reports of Japanese transports headed towards Malaya. And by the 10th of December, Pearl Harbor has occurred. MacArthur's Air Force is in flames on the ground. And Phillips and Palliser are at the bottom of the South China Sea with the Prince of Wales and Repulse. And so the Japanese resolve the question of how you're going to defend Singapore for the Allies. So the special relationship, yes, Churchill, Roosevelt, they had respect for each other. They were not friends. Remember that Churchill always noted, history will be kind to me, for I shall write it. And so his discussion of the special relationship is seen through very interesting tinted glasses. If you have an interest in Churchill, I strongly urge you to read a book by a British historian named David Reynolds. It's called Churchill in Command of History. And it's a book about how Churchill wrote his 6-volume history of the Second World War. To me, it's fascinating from the standpoint of it's not only about how did he manipulate history, but how did he manipulate the people around him to manipulate history. Was Roosevelt intent on bringing the United States into the war? My view is he was an unwilling participant. He was willing to be dragged in the Atlantic. I don't believe that he wanted a war in the Pacific. And I'm sure somebody will be happy to debate that point. And again, Churchill is a grand strategist. I've already spoken to that. So this is what I think we got right. Already talked about most of that. And so my argument is all of the planning that took place. If you asked somebody in, say, January or February of 1942 whether or not the British and Americans had spent 4 years talking to each other about how to plan for war, I think they'd have said you were nuts. But in fact, that discussion did take place. And even though it did not account for the Japanese, and we grossly underestimated the Japanese, both us and the Brits, the things that were done for the long term, I think, sowed the seeds for eventual victory. It probably would have occurred, but we saved a lot of lives and a lot of treasure. And so with that, I've talked about some of that already, and I think I will stop and take questions.
Why did FDR be so equivocating? Did he have confidence in Marshall? Did he have confidence in the people within his staffing, military staffing, to carry out?
Sure. No, I think he had ultimate faith in George Marshall and Harold Stark. What he didn't have faith in was the American Congress. The Congress at this point is very split. Roosevelt does not believe that he can get a declaration of war through Congress. And I think he was correct. So when the British are sailing back from the Atlantic Conference in August of '41, they're very disappointed. They thought Roosevelt was going to come into the war. And in fact, Churchill had told Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, that Roosevelt would not have invited me if he wasn't going to come into the war. Well, when the Brits are sailing back to England, the renewal of conscription passes in the House of Representatives by 1 vote. And in a British system, that would have been a fall of government. And so the British were crushed. They thought that there was going to, all this going on in August of 1941 in the Atlantic, the invasion of Russia, all of those things, they just believe that the Americans aren't coming into the war. And I don't think Roosevelt believes he can deliver.
I learned recently that in the halls of the British, that people that Churchill was dealing with had gone so far just to have somebody check with Mussolini to see what arrangements they could make with Hitler for an armistice. And in 1940, being short, Churchill jumps up on a desk and starts speaking to his people about how they can't do that. And so it got withdrawn. And from there, he went on to the fight him on the beaches and so forth and so on speech. So I don't think there was any difference between the 1940 or the 1939 or the 1938 or the 1941 Churchill. It's just that he was able to come to the forefront and inspire Great Britain to stay in and fight, especially since they got those 400,000 men back off the beaches of Belgium. And that was the turning point to give Churchill the jump that he needed to get them to not surrender to terms like the earlier Prime Minister did, peace in our time. And the thing is, Great Britain had no money, and they had to come to America to get the money and get the equipment and everything else. Remember the thing with the old boats for some 100 years leases in the Bahamas?
Which are going to be up here soon?
Yeah, and what happens, I had a spy all during that time from 1938. in England. That was my second wife. And she was born in 1938 and lived in the war and knew what went on in England from then on. And like in the 46 election, honor Churchill and vote for, I forget the other guy's name, but
Attlee.
Clement Attlee. Yeah. And so what happened is, I happen to be a big fan of Winston Churchill, like I told you before the meeting started. And so what happened is I'm sitting here looking at this from the British advantage, and you're explaining it from the American advantage. And so I learned a lot from you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
How much do you think the racial attitudes of the British and the Americans had to do with their underestimating the Japanese in the Far East?
Oh, clearly. Yeah. The short answer is absolutely. We did not take them seriously. They're Japanese. Why should we? We're British and Americans. And I think we grossly underestimated their capacity. Yes, sir.
How obviously, Pearl Harbor changed everything, but how do you think this would have unfolded, say, the next 6 to 12 months, the trajectory we were on with Britain and the European War? What do you think would have happened had Pearl Harbor not happened at that time?
I think that's a very interesting question, because at the Atlantic Conference, Roosevelt tells Churchill, I can't give you a declaration of war, but I will make war until the Germans do something. And so I think there would have been increasing there was increasing U.S. naval. The U.S. Navy starts escorting convoys on the 15th of September, 1941. That's the first eastbound convoy, 14th, I think. First eastbound convoy we take out, and then we pick up a British convoy coming west on the 16th. There are the SS Robin Moore, a merchantman, was sunk in the South Atlantic. The USS Reuben James, a destroyer, was sunk with 110 dead. The destroyer Greer was attacked by submarines. We were involved in a shooting war in the North Atlantic from September on. Say again?
And the Kearney.
Yes, and the Kearney as well. And so I think that would have eventually brought things in. Now, the interesting thing to me is Hitler is saying to the wolf packs, to the Dönitz, the old U-boat commander, do not antagonize the Americans, because we don't want to bring them into the war. And then I'm sure all of you know that on 11 December 41, Hitler declares war on the United States, which I think is one of the many great strategic mistakes he made. So long story short, I think we would have got pulled in the Atlantic. The Japanese were going to continue to advance. The key question is, would the United States, absent Pearl Harbor, have gone to war to defend Singapore and the Dutch Netherlands, East Indies? I'm not so sure, personally. We would have been much more focused on Germany.
I'm halfway through the 4th book of his 6-volume series. And what a life. What a life. Do you have an anecdote or two about him as a young man, maybe his escape from the prison camp? And also, I'm struck in the book by his personal courage, the danger he consistently put himself in at age 65. Flying in planes, on the sea, very, very brave man.
Some of his British commanders would have called him not just courageous, but rash.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm sorry. The question was, one, do I have any anecdote about Churchill as a young man, as a younger subaltern, particularly in South Africa? And the short answer to that is no. I'm sorry. I don't know that much. I can give you a couple things. And then there was a remark about Churchill's personal courage and bravery. I think that's without doubt. Churchill was an intensely brave, romantic, 19th century Victorian man. And that meant everything to him. He had to be held back from going ashore in Normandy. He had to be held back from getting too close to the crossing of the Rhine in early 1945. There were many times in the Second World War where he took great risks to his personal safety. And as most of you know, when he left government after Gallipoli in 1915, he went into the trenches in World War I. So again, no question about his courage. I think some people had occasional questions about his wisdom.
Could you talk a little bit about the impact of the Soviet Union's invasion by Germany on not just British relations to Russia, but also the alliance, the evolving alliance, how things may have changed between Britain and the United States in this period?
Almost immediately after the Germans invade, Stalin begins making demands on both the United States and Britain for war materiel and allocations. Franklin Roosevelt really wants to help and support because, again, his idea is if the Russians are killing Germans, then Americans don't have to go do that. And so Roosevelt is pressuring his own subordinates in the United States, and he's pressuring Churchill to take some of the British Lend-Lease allocation and give that to the Russians. And so there's an intense pressure that changes that whole calculation. And that's one of the reasons why you get the Atlantic Conference in '41 is because Roosevelt and Marshall in particular, knows that he does not have enough materiel for the American Army and the American Air Force. So how am I going to supply the British and supply the Russians at the same time? And the British have got to come to some semblance of rational choice because they keep changing their minds. First, destroyers are important, then tanks are important, then bombers are important. Well, as many of you know, you don't turn assembly lines around when you're building aircraft and tanks. And so it was a tremendous change. And in fact, in the book, I talk about a visit that Harriman and Beaverbrook, the British Minister of Aircraft, take to Moscow in October 1941, where they hammer out agreements for the reallocation of aircraft in particular, and it mostly comes out of British hide.
Can you briefly tell us what was going on the other side at that time and how that influenced these conversations? I mean, the joining of Bulgaria and Romania and those various countries that we don't know much about.
It really was, I'm getting a little far out my field, but from my readings, you had wars inside of wars. And you had a larger European war, and part of that internal war was the war that was going on against the Soviet Union. I don't think we understand. I certainly had a friend that brought this out to me the other day. The Romanians fielded 400,000 troops against the Russians. There was an entire Romanian army on the Eastern Front because they did not like communism and they did not like the Russians. And so you've got all of that, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland has been dismembered, but there is Hungary, a very large anti-Soviet thrust to what's going on in the Eastern Front. Quite frankly, the Eastern Front does not play a significant role during this time period. In fact, there's a belief among the Army General Staff, in the United States at least, that the Russians won't last 3 months. And that if the Germans defeat the Russians, then they will turn on Britain with a full vengeance. And so it was, I think, a closely run thing. They were more concerned, particularly at this point in time, I think, with the Battle of the North Atlantic and how the United States Navy and maybe Air Force. When you look at the ABC-1 agreements, they talk about sending a regimental combat team to Britain as a token force to show an American ground presence. But it's mostly about ships, convoying, and bombers.
The strong antagonism of quite a few American military leaders towards the British, how were they able to overcome that? Or was it just, well, our president said we got to do it, so we got to do it? Or did their attitudes toward the British change during this time?
Bias up front. I'm a big fan of George Marshall. And I think Marshall was able to take advantage. Marshall brings Embick back on active duty to do this job at the ABC-1. He trusts his judgment as far as being a strategic leader and thinker, but he puts the brakes on Embick's more anti-British approach. I think Harold Stark does the same thing. Stark served on Sims's staff. You remember Admiral Sims from World War I? Stark served with the British in World War I. And so he had a closer and more personal relationship. And we've all been in organizations where there's multiple personalities that try and drag the organization in a different direction. Well, I think in Harold Stark and George Marshall, you had two very far-sighted leaders who could make the most of their subordinates but tamp down the anti-British sentiments. If you just look at the idea, think of this idea. The Navy Stark sends Robert Gormley to talk with the British, not Richmond Kelly Turner. I think there was a reason why Stark sent Gormley. I think there's a reason why General Cheney gets sent to Britain in May of 1940, and it's not Embick or Wedemeyer. Wedemeyer still by this point is a colonel. If you don't know about Wedemeyer, he starts off the war as a major and ends as a lieutenant general.
What was the attitude after Stalingrad and after the Russians were stopped outside Moscow? Or the Germans were stopped outside Moscow?
Yeah, well, certainly by December 41, when the offensive stops outside Moscow, you begin to see a shift that the Americans begin. But in June, remembering the first 6 weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans take millions of prisoners, casualties. They take thousands of square miles. They are on the verge. Quite honestly, again, if Hitler doesn't make some dumb decisions, they get to Moscow. Now, Napoleon got to Moscow too. Didn't seem to help him. But I think that it could have made a dramatic difference. Once you get to the October rains, where the mud begins to slow down the Germans, because we forget, it's only about 10%, 15% of the German army is mechanized. The rest of it's horse-drawn and foot-drawn. And having been a light infantryman and walked everywhere I went, with the exception of when we gratefully rode helicopters, it's tough slogging through mud. You don't go very far very fast. And so once they get to October, they begin to brighten a little bit in their forecasts. And in December, but again, remember the German spring and summer offensive in 1942, they get even further. That's what takes them to Stalingrad. But by then there's a belief that the Russians will survive.
Well, that European war was settled on the east, not in the Atlantic.
I think I'm...
By and large.
Yeah, no. If you want to talk about who defeated the Wehrmacht, the Russian army defeated the Wehrmacht. Mm-hmm. Yes. The United States and the Brits gave the coup de grace, but the Russians bled the Germans white. Now, having said that, you could have strangled Britain. Britain came very close to being starved, and it wouldn't have mattered if the Russians were winning on the Eastern Front if the British had to capitulate.
Well, and you can find out more about that in January when we do the Stalingrad program.
Well, you mentioned that after the Germans attacked Russia, 3 million Russians were captured. The 3 million Russian soldiers surrendered to the Germans because they hated Stalin. It's only when the Germans start killing them off through marches and Auschwitz and other places that they began to fight and stop them cold. I was conquered by the Russians as a child because my mother visited America. She was prime suspect to be sent to Siberia, Gulag for Americans, we call it Siberia, etc. So Hitler is my favorite because the train was in town, and if the Germans would not have attacked, we would have been in Siberia and I would have been dead.
Well, Len, we're glad you're alive.
Well, there's certainly no doubt that another one of the major strategic errors that Hitler made was not capitalizing on the anti-communist sentiment. It's interesting. One of my students this year is from Ukraine.
Well, listen, we're going to stop here. I hope you'll come up and express how much we've learned this evening. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for putting up with me.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.